The scent of freshly cut grass hung in the air, a familiar and comforting aroma that signaled the arrival of summer. It was a scent that brought back memories of simpler times, of carefree days spent outdoors. It was a typical sunny afternoon on Hawthorne Street, the kind where time seemed to drift by at a slower pace. The sun cast a warm golden glow over the neighborhood, and the gentle hum of lawnmowers and distant chatter created a serene backdrop. Children's laughter echoed from a nearby park, a stark contrast to the quiet tension brewing inside me. Their carefree joy was a reminder of the innocence that once permeated our community, an innocence that now felt distant and elusive. I glanced across the street at the two-story colonial house, its windows dark and lifeless. The house, once a symbol of suburban tranquility, now stood as a haunting reminder of the events that had shattered our peace. It had been a year since the tragedy struck, casting a long shadow over our once peaceful neighborhood. The sense of unease was palpable, a lingering presence that refused to be ignored.
Charles, the owner of that house, had always been a bit of an enigma. He was a man of few words, his expressions often guarded as if he carried secrets too heavy to share. A solitary man, he kept to himself, but he always had a kind smile and a wave whenever our paths crossed. His gestures, though small, were a comforting constant in our daily routines. We weren't close friends, not in the traditional sense, but there was a comfortable familiarity that came with being neighbors for over a decade. Our conversations were brief, yet they carried a sense of mutual respect and understanding. Our interactions were limited to small talk over the fence, the occasional borrowed cup of sugar, the kind of casual exchanges that form the bedrock of suburban life. These moments, though seemingly insignificant, wove a tapestry of connection that bound us together.
But that was before the events that would change everything, altering the fabric of our community in ways we could never have anticipated, before the disappearance of his son, Ethan. The news of Ethan's disappearance spread like wildfire, igniting a wave of fear and uncertainty that rippled through our neighborhood. Before Charles became a recluse, his face etched with an unspeakable grief that seemed to age him decades. The once vibrant man now appeared as a shadow of his former self, consumed by a sorrow that was impossible to fathom. The once pristine lawn grew wild and unkempt, a physical manifestation of the despair that had taken root within those walls. The house, once a beacon of suburban pride, now stood as a testament to the heartache that had befallen its inhabitants. And it was into this darkness that I found myself unwillingly drawn, my neighborly concern morphing into something far more unsettling. The sense of duty I felt towards Charles and his plight was overshadowed by a growing curiosity, a need to understand the depth of his sorrow and the mystery that surrounded his son's disappearance. As I approached the house, my steps were hesitant, each one weighed down by the gravity of the situation. The air seemed thicker, the silence more profound, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the stillness. I raised my hand to knock on the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound of my knuckles against the wood echoed in the quiet, a stark reminder of the isolation that had enveloped Charles and his home. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a dimly lit interior that seemed to swallow the light. The air inside was heavy with the scent of neglect, a stark contrast to the vibrant life that once filled these rooms. As I stepped inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was intruding on something sacred, a space that had been untouched by the outside world for far too long. The walls seemed to whisper secrets, the shadows dancing with memories of a happier time. I found myself drawn to a photo album lying on a dusty table. As I flipped through the pages, I saw glimpses of a life that once was, smiling faces, joyful moments, a family that had been torn apart by tragedy. One photo in particular caught my eye. A young boy with a bright smile, his eyes full of life. It was Ethan, the boy whose disappearance had cast a shadow over our neighborhood. The weight of his absence was palpable, a void that could never be filled. As I closed the photo album, I felt a sense of resolve wash over me. I knew that I couldn't change the past, but perhaps, in some small way, I could help bring a sense of closure to Charles and our community. The journey ahead would be difficult, but it was one that I felt compelled to undertake. Ethan was a bright, cheerful boy of 10, full of life and energy. His laughter was like a melody that could lift anyone's spirits. He was always eager to lend a helping hand, whether it was carrying groceries for a neighbour or tidying up the yard. Ethan often played in their front yard, his favourite spot to kick around a ball or ride his bicycle. His infectious laughter carried across the street, bringing joy to everyone who heard it. He was the kind of kid who could brighten even the dullest day, always ready with a smile or a kind word. Then, one ordinary afternoon, he vanished without a trace, leaving behind only his toys and an eerie silence. The news spread through our community like wildfire, igniting a wave of panic and concern. It left a trail of shock and disbelief in its wake, as people struggled to comprehend the sudden disappearance.
Search parties were organized immediately, with volunteers scouring every inch of the neighborhood and beyond. Missing person posters were plastered on every street corner, each one a stark reminder of the urgency of the situation. But despite the extensive search efforts, Ethan was never found. The woods and playgrounds remained eerily empty. The police investigated thoroughly, questioning neighbors and following every lead. They scoured the surrounding woods, leaving no stone unturned in their desperate search. But their efforts proved futile, as if Ethan had simply vanished into thin air. As days turned into weeks, then months, the initial hope dwindled, replaced by a growing sense of despair. The community's spirit was crushed, and a heavy blanket of sorrow settled over everyone.
The tragedy hit Charles the hardest. He was Ethan's father, and the loss was unbearable. He became a shell of his former self, consumed by grief and unable to find solace. His eyes, once full of life, were now hollowed out by the weight of his sorrow. His shoulders slumped under the burden of his loss, and he moved through life like a shadow. He rarely left the house, except for occasional trips to the grocery store, where he moved like a ghost among the aisles. His face was a mask of pain, a constant reminder of the tragedy that had befallen him. The once warm glow of his home had been extinguished, replaced by an eerie silence that spoke volumes. The house, once filled with laughter and joy, was now a silent testament to the loss that had shattered their lives. It was a crisp autumn evening when Charles knocked on my door, his face drawn and pale. He needed to borrow a shovel, he explained, his voice a raspy whisper. Claimed he needed to move some dirt in his backyard for a gardening project. I hesitated for a moment, a knot of unease forming in my stomach. Gardening in late fall seemed odd, even for someone as private as Charles.
I lent him the shovel, trying to ignore the nagging feeling of dread creeping up my spine. I watched from my window as he retreated across the street, the shovel looking heavy and ominous in his grip. The image of him disappearing into his backyard, swallowed by the growing darkness, stayed with me long after he was gone.
That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. I tossed and turned in bed, my mind replaying the events of the day. Why would Charles need a shovel at this time of year? And why did he seem so evasive? The questions gnawed at me, fueling my growing suspicion. Days turned into nights, each one colder and more unsettling than the last. The once warm and inviting evenings now felt like a prelude to something sinister, something lurking just beyond the veil of darkness. The once familiar sounds of crickets chirping and owls hooting now seemed amplified, distorted by my own fear. Each chirp and hoot echoed in my mind, a constant reminder of the eerie silence that followed. Sleep became a luxury I could ill afford. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside my window, sending a jolt of adrenaline through me. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be out there, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike.
One particularly chilly night, I was jarred awake by a strange noise. It was unlike anything I had heard before, a sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. It was a muffled thud, followed by the scraping sound of metal against dirt. The noise was rhythmic, almost methodical, as if someone was digging with a purpose.
The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I crept closer to the window, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the cold sweat forming on my forehead as I peered through the blinds, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. Through a gap in the curtains, I could see a flickering light coming from Charles's backyard. The light danced and flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own.
He was out there, in the dead of night, digging. His figure was barely visible, illuminated only by the faint glow of the flickering light. The shovel, silhouetted against the faint moonlight, rose and fell with a rhythmic precision that sent shivers down my spine. Each movement seemed deliberate, as if he was following some unseen instructions.
I watched, hidden in the shadows of my bedroom as he worked tirelessly, his movements fueled by a desperate urgency that I couldn't comprehend. The scene was surreal, like something out of a nightmare, and I couldn't tear my eyes away. What was he burying out there in the darkness? The question gnawed at me, filling me with a sense of dread and curiosity. I knew I had to find out, but the fear of what I might discover kept me rooted to the spot, watching in silent horror. I couldn't let it go. The image of Charles digging in the dead of night haunted me, fueling my suspicions. I knew I had to do something, had to find out what he was hiding. So, one afternoon, while he was out, I snuck into his backyard. My heart hammered in my chest with each step I took toward the freshly dug earth.
The air hung heavy with the metallic scent of blood.
I froze, my blood running cold. My gaze fell on a small, muddy shoe half buried in the dirt. It was Ethan's. A wave of nausea washed over me as I stumbled back, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a scream. The truth, horrific and undeniable, slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. I had stumbled upon something sinister, something that made my skin crawl and my stomach churn. Panic welled up inside me, threatening to consume me. I stumbled back to my house, my mind racing. The friendly neighbor, the grieving father, was a facade, a carefully constructed mask to hide a horrifying truth. I had unknowingly been living next to a monster, sharing pleasantries with a man capable of unspeakable acts. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I was in over my head.
The weight of my discovery pressed down on me, suffocating me with fear and dread. I didn't know what to do, who to turn to.
Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows sent my heart racing. I was a prisoner in my own home, too terrified to even step outside, convinced that he was watching my every move.